and welcome back to the Deprogram. Today we have quite the treat for you guys. It will be my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, which is Mr. Pankaj Mishra. He is a critically acclaimed writer, essayist, and public intellectual. He's known for his insightful analysis and quite profound, in my opinion, overview of general global affairs, history, and politics. His work includes From the Ruins Empire, Age of Anger, and Bland Fanatics, which is my favorite of your works, if I can sneak in a little commentary there. His critique, particularly sharp, of modernity and its various colonial legacies has been insightful, and that's why he's also a frequent contributor to major publications such as the New York Times, The Guardian, amongst others. His latest work is The World After Gaza, which is what we'll be focusing on a little bit today. So welcome, Mr. Mishra. I hope you're doing well.
Thank you, Akim.
Could you please just tell the people a little bit about yourself? Just give them a general overview. You're quite the public intellectual. People know who you are, but if you could just let people know a little bit about yourself.
Very simply, and maybe this is connected to the book that I've just published. I'm a writer who's grown up in India, who writes with a perspective that takes into account the experiences of a part of the human population that, let's say, American readers or American listeners are not so much exposed to, especially if they rely upon purely American media platforms. My role, as I see it, has been as a nonfiction writer to bring some of those experiences closer to audiences that otherwise have very little access to them. My role has been to describe histories, political histories, intellectual histories, to explore literary traditions, philosophical traditions that are relatively unknown to people in the West.
Beautifully put. Yes, exactly right. And that's why so many of your works are critically acclaimed. And we will get into that a little bit with a slight overview. This particular book that you're publishing, The World After Gaza, you start, at least in the very beginning, and throughout the book really, but you begin with a discussion of the intersections of race and colonial legacies regarding Israel, and then you compare the positions of certain post-independent nations to the Palestinian issue with the current state of Western nations and their perspective on the issue, and vice versa. If you could give people a general overview of your conclusions from the analysis that you carried out here, what would you say? What is the kernel of what you've analyzed?
Well, I think one thing that's become clear, perhaps oppressively clear in the last 2 weeks or so, that the foundations of the modern world, starting in the 19th century, were laid in white supremacy and a mode of racial imperialism or racial capitalism that insisted on a very strict hierarchy, on giving rights to people who were white or sort of people who were collaborating with the white ruling classes in many parts of the world, and deny those rights to others, mainly on the grounds that they were both non-white and weak. You can see that now when Trump seeks to sanction South Africa for treatment of white Afrikaners, white South Africans. I'm sure we'll probably soon reach a stage where Trump sanctions South Africa for carrying on an anti-apartheid struggle, because we definitely had done that path. But I think I'm using this to remind your listeners of just how alive that particular history remains. It has been suppressed for a long time by liberal platitudes about the international world order and America's right to promote democracy and human rights around the world. But that is the longer history in which I've tried to place this, smaller and relatively shorter history of Israel and the Middle East. And I think what we often do is take this history out of its longer context of racial imperialism and the struggle against racial imperialism in different parts of the world, including the struggles waged by, Jewish people in Europe and indeed elsewhere in many different Arab countries, and the sympathy extended to those Jews by people in Asia and Africa. And that's also kind of a part of the story that's not much told. That's something that I've tried to tell. So I think today what we are looking at is a consolidation of white supremacist political parties, movements, ruling classes across Western Europe. Alongside that consolidation, together with the far right regime in Israel, which has decided that its safety, its future lies in collaboration with far right political parties and movements in the West, no matter how anti-Semitic they are. And I think that is something we need to explore and understand. How did this happen? How did this come about? This longer history has to be explored. The history of racial imperialism, the fight for liberation from that racial imperialism by the countries of Asia and Africa, and the role, the changing role that Israel and the quest for Israel has played in these larger struggles. So I describe in my book how the earliest leaders of anti colonial movements were sympathetic to the idea of a Jewish homeland simply because they saw Jews, European Jews, as fellow victims of European racism, and extended their sympathies. And someone like Gandhi, who many people would not know, was sympathetic to Zionism. He was well informed about the sort of quest for a Jewish homeland. Some of his closest friends in South Africa were Jewish. Likewise, with the great Chinese nationalist leader Sun Yat-sen. So I think after 1948, of course, what happened was that the state of Israel came into being, and simultaneously, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were dispossessed, were forced to leave their homes and become refugees in different parts of the world, including the neighboring states of Israel. And today they're being asked to leave again their sort of homeland and become a diasporic community. So this is a sort of history of violence. This is a history of dispossession, much longer history in which Israel and now its conflict with the Palestinians has come to play a very prominent role. And of course, at this sort of that this conflict is being played out on a sort of old fault line between the racial imperialists who first seized the juiciest, sort of the most cherished fruits of modernity, of capitalism, and basically condemned a large part of the world to the role of permanent losers. And again, we are looking at a kind of a confrontation between the haves and the have-nots, and it's getting more and more brutal. And it's become very clear the side on which the state of Israel, at least Israel's ruling class, wants to be on.
Exactly right. It's very interesting that you cover the side that the ruling class in particular would like to be on. Of course, generally this is a discussion between leftists here. We tend to center a bit, or sometimes maybe some people criticize and say we over centralize on the economic perspective, and that's why intersectional analysis has been developed. But the intersectionality of the white settler idea or settlerism in general, colonial ideas that have morphed into what modern day Zionism is and what it was founded as in all practice, shows that even the or large portions of the population within Israel that are not part of the ruling class kind of share certain end goals, and that's because they have other justifications. It's not necessarily the same ones that the ruling class has. But this kind of leads me to another question. It's a little bit outside the scope. You touch on it a little bit just in the book, and it is the motivations that the general, or like the overarching motivation, let's say, of these colonial or formerly colonial nations have towards maintaining this sort of status quo. You mentioned about, for example, the cover that's ran for Israel, and then how it parallels certain colonial activities of these formerly colonizing nations. And in many circumstances, this is contrary to what would be in their overarching economic interest, let's say. Maybe in the short term it means like weapons profits or something, but long term it's not good for them, especially on the diplomatic stage. And I wonder, what is your interpretation of this? Why is it that Israel is given almost like the sacred cow, excuse the pun there, status amongst these formerly colonizing nations? Is it simply just because they see their own history reflected in Israel? Is it really as simple as a kind of defense of the ego, or is there something deeper, more beyond just like the simple propaganda that we hear?
I think, it would be a mistake to reduce this alliance and this emotional, very strong emotional sympathy with Israel to a matter of economic interests,
Hmm.
or even the interests of, people in America who want to invest in Israel or have economic connections with the tech sector there or the security industry there, because that is definitely a part of it. But I think increasingly Israel represents, and I write about this in my book, to Israel represents to many people in Western Europe and America a certain culture of impunity. The idea that you can get away with a lot of things that you were previously not allowed to get away with. So, it's not surprising at all that the assault on Gaza, the consent secured for it by Israel amongst Western nations, among Western ruling classes, that what is happening here in many ways is a certain kind of consensus that is being solidified that this is the way to treat the weak and the powerless in your own societies. So, for instance, to give you a very concrete example, when Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, when he was still the leader of the opposition, when this war erupted, and what he said was how, essentially Israel has a right to withhold power and water from the Palestinians. He's a human rights lawyer, but this was a clear, violation of everything human rights law, international law is about. Now, why was he saying that? Is this purely because of some kind of a closet sympathy for Zionism? No, I think it's something more straightforward than that, which is that he's preparing the ground for his own sort of policies and the kind of authoritarian mindset that he would bring to office. And sure enough, as he's come to office, and declared war on some of the weakest and most powerless people in the United Kingdom, cutting benefits for disabled people. Now he's going after, he's boasting on Twitter about his crackdown on what are described as illegal immigrants. You have, the Home Secretary, no less, leading a video team and the police in while the police raids migrants and deports them. All this is being shot on video and being advertised as an example of just how tough the new government is. So you're looking at a new mood, a new mentality, a new kind of authoritarian, increasingly brutal mindset. And Israel, in many ways, simply by sanctifying a certain kind of violence and oppression, has become really important to many of these countries. Again, as a sort of as a trendsetter in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So it is much more than diplomatic interest, because, as you say quite correctly, the diplomatic interests or the geopolitical interests of the United States are being damaged very profoundly by its solid support for what Israel is up to. It's alienating even its closest allies in the region apart from Israel. That's Saudi Arabia, uh, Turkey, its NATO partner, Jordan, Egypt. What for, really? But I think we are in a crisis state right now, where increasingly Western democracies are turning more authoritarian, more invested in disciplines and strategies of widespread oppression. And this is why Israel has become so hugely important to these ruling classes.
Very interesting point. I appreciate the nuance. I kind of tried to poke at what you where you would set that nuance, but it's love to hear your perspective on this. Kind of semi related. I don't want to like center too much on it, but you have a concept that I believe you developed. I haven't seen the particular phrasing before, but you call it the Americanization of the Shoah, or the Americanization of the Holocaust. Could you please elaborate what you mean with this? So, what is the concept? What is this concept, or what are the consequences of this concept?
Well, I think, first of all, the Shoah, the Holocaust, as an event was not registered in the consciousness of many, many Americans until very late in the 20th century. This is something that we tend to
Yes.
forget, especially younger people who have kind of grown up with it and think that the Holocaust or its memory was always there, institutionalized in museums. No, this was late development, starting the 70s, accelerating throughout the 80s and 90s. There are specific, moments, landmarks here: the inauguration of the Holocaust Museum, the release of Schindler's List, the rise in the number of Jewish political organizations that police opinion on this subject, that also lobby various politicians in both political parties to support their cause. This was all done starting in the 1970s, and one very clear aim in sight, which is the protection and defense of Israel, and also the advancement of Israel's supporters in the United States, most importantly. These supporters need not be Jewish or even Zionists in any sort of significant way, but simply, I think, Israel attracted a certain kind of right-leaning person starting the 1970s onwards, and that has now, in a way, moved from being a kind of minor cult to being essentially a very large hub of corporate power, of organized corporate power against the organized left. Now, there are many aspects to this, but I'm really kind of focusing attention here on the deliberate construction of the Holocaust as an American memory. People, when those museums were being set up, and I quote one of the more eminent historians on this at great length in the book, were asking like questions: in what way is the Holocaust an American event? If you're going to commemorate the Holocaust, what about the Holocaust? What about the genocides suffered by members of other minority groups who live in this country? Are we also going to commemorate them? The answer is, clearly no, but certainly not to the same extent as the Holocaust is commemorated. So those questions, they're not asked anymore. We've simply assumed that this is something, very much part of the American consciousness, part of the American memory. You have to take a step back and look at history to realize that this was very deliberately done from the 1970s onwards, and it has had consequences in the sense that we know that it's been really difficult to voice criticism of Israel, whether in mainstream politics or in the mainstream media. It has created, a bipartisan sort of support for Israel, which is bad for Israel. It's also bad for the United States. It has, created really a lot of violence and a lot of disorder. And, I think with Trump, we are really now looking at a kind of monstrous culmination of this Americanization of the Shoah. It is now ending in an act of ethnic cleansing actively led by the United States, in which Israel itself is taking a sort of, a sort of backseat.
Exactly right. It's interesting that even throughout the previous administration or regime, whatever we'd like to call it, with the United States, there was this overwhelming American presence and support and almost confirmation to everything Israel doing, to the extent that Israel would not have been able to do anything that it would like or think of without the approval, either implicit or explicit, of the United States. What's interesting also is because you mentioned, and you talk a good bit about it also, is certain countries within Europe that feel a responsibility for the Holocaust, and as a result have this almost intrinsic loyalty towards the state of Israel, despite the fact that there's no continuity between.
Did someone say Germany? Sorry.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's where we're getting to, and how it's the entire justification for the existence of the German state in its current formation, that is the support or security of Israel. Could you speak a little bit about this, the motivations behind this? What is your analysis there?
That's very interesting. That's another kind of ideological manipulation of the memory of the Shoah. Again, as I describe in my book, the German posture of repentance, which is now globally known because it has now kind of resulted in some extraordinary German support and enabling of the eradication of Gaza. And constantly we've heard invocations of how Germany has no choice but to support Israel because of what it did to the European Jewish population during the Holocaust. Now, this posture has also been in the making for some time now, and it did not emerge automatically from any kind of genuine reckoning with the crimes of Nazis, no genuine reckoning with the Nazis who survived the Second World War and then went on to occupy important positions in the German government and in German political life and public life. I think it's very clear. I mean, the quotations alone tell you a story about, how the German chancellor saw close relations with Israel, arms deals with Israel, as a way of earning greater international respectability and of another way of bringing his country closer to the West, realizing, as the German chancellor put it, that he has to do this in order to appeal to the new constituencies, security constituencies, pro-Israel lobbies, constituencies that were emerging in the United States. So they had to kind of enter into these kinds of transactional relationships with Israel, where as the Israeli philosopher who I quote in the book puts it, that they basically give us a lot of cash, they give us a lot of weapons, and we basically extend to them a kind of indulgence, absolve them of their sins, and that is the nature of this relationship at government to government level. At various other levels, this relationship is also marked by very serious distortions. Whether it's the German press at different times projecting a taboo nationalism, a nationalism that's taboo in Germany or has been until the rise of the far right there, projecting it onto Israel. So seeing sort of Israeli generals or Israeli victories in terms first invoked by the Nazis, very disturbing phenomena. At another level, the phenomena of Germans claiming to be Jewish, and that has also been documented. I think the overall point that I'm trying to make is the Holocaust was such a monstrous rupture in the moral history of mankind that it would have been amazing in this in oh, if it hadn't, if it didn't have such consequences in the politics and culture of countries like Germany and the United States. The offense, as it were, the great offense, and I quote Primo Levi quite a bit in the book, sort of lives on in these kinds of insidious and oppressive ways. And Germany is yet another example of this. How from kind of presiding over, actively participating in the destruction of the European Jewish population, it has now become complicit in the acts of mass extermination in Gaza.
They quite literally found utility in one of the worst events of human history, which they are now using as a cudgel, as a tool for repeating the very same course of events which has led to the previous horrible event that they are utilizing as a utility. It's like, not to do like classic moral posturing or whatever, but it's the disgust that every person with any moral fiber should feel towards this, let's call it, development, cannot be put into words. That's why this line of analysis, I think, is very powerful. And both mentioning the Americanization of the Holocaust and Germany in particular, where like I've seen plenty of times, correct me if I'm wrong, but looking at anti-Semitism, which was utilized to kind of push this incredible ultranationalist fervor towards genocide of an entire people. In Germany, in particular, you cannot utilize the analysis of, the othering of a group, the putting the entire all blame on why everything is going badly in our state on this particular group, so that you can muster this hateful fervor against them and then create political power, etc., which is obviously a massive, to an extent, an oversimplification, but what led to the Holocaust, at least in Germany proper. In Germany right now, you cannot, to an extent, use the argument that this kind of othering can be applied to most other states and most minority groups in general, and that an event such as the Holocaust can be replicated for other groups inside of ethnocentric fascist states of this or the other category. So they're quite literally completely hyper-focusing on the Holocaust, not as a tool, historic tool that we can learn from, so that the same thing cannot happen anywhere else. They're saying no, the same thing can literally happen nowhere else, because this is a very specific case. And now, not only are we going to say this, we will also utilize it as a reason for Israel's actions in Gaza and wider. And that's just, I don't know, it's insane.
I think the amount of, as you just described, the amount of intellectual and moral acrobatics you have to perform in order to justify your support for plainly genocidal regime. I think it's extraordinary that we've been actually sort of witnessing this over the last sort of 15 months, trying to make sense of it. But as I said, it can really only be understood as part of, or a consequence of, a larger failure to reckon with what Germany did during the Second War. And I think I would also say the haste with which Germany was accepted into the Western alliance against Soviet communism also meant that sort of reckoning was endlessly postponed, and basically that reckoning turned into a series of ritualized events, setting up a kind of memorial in Berlin, instituting various kind of educational courses, commemorating certain events, and all this, mind you, again, these are sort of relatively recent events, or these are events that have been put into the calendar quite recently in the last 20 years or so. But this is how sort of nations tend to process their memory. In the case of Germany, we are really looking at a nation that was responsible for 2 world wars in the 20th century, and now stands partly responsible for the greatest atrocity of the 21st century thus far.
Exactly right. And this kind of leads into another concept or another idea that you develop very interestingly, is when you discuss Alfred Kazin and his particular perspective, or his writing at least. You even titled it the clash narratives of the show of slavery and colonialism. That's the kind of the point I want to get at, because we're dancing around it a little bit. And it's the idea that there is an a immeasurable amount of populations that were subject to similar levels of violence, particularly under the colonial boot, let's say, which involved many of the same things, camps and forced labor, and even up to extermination and ethnic cleansing, that is in no way, as you mentioned, remembered in the same way, or idealized, not maybe that has a positive connotation, but made sanctified, let's say, into this glistening memory that cannot be touched, that cannot be reinterpreted. Not that the event having occurred and the sheer magnitude of whatnot, none of this is under question, but the fact that it is used as a justification for example, what Israel is currently doing, and that other nations and other populations that have been subject to things very similar to this are never extended the same, let's say, goodwill, if you even want to say, call it goodwill, or this excuse at the very least. I'm wondering what is your perspective there? Why is that the case? What is so special about this form of violence, particularly against European Jews, which allows the eventual Western world, and by proxy through force the entire rest of the world, to fall down this path of accepting this justification for Israel's actions through the lens of, well, the Holocaust happened, while the same understanding is not granted to whatever other population, be it the South Africans or whatever, wherever else.
Well, I mean, I think, the reasons should be obvious. For instance, Germany also inflicted horrific atrocities on Africans. It also inflicted them on the Chinese, but there is no institutional memory of these bloody events in Germany today, because there is simply no incentive. As I said, the relations with Israel were from the very beginning transactional. They were driven by extremely cynical motives, and they remain so today. With poorer countries in Africa, there isn't the same incentive to project a moral posture, to institutionalize a memory of colonial violence. And of course, you're right. I mean, I think a lot of the colonial violence that Europeans inflicted on Asia and Africa prefigured, in many ways, prepared the way for the violence they inflicted on Europeans themselves. And in fact, people have argued that the greatest sin of Hitler, in many Western eyes, was that he brought to Europe the European ways of treating the Asian and African native, and that was unforgivable. That kind of treatment was really reserved for people of the lower races, so to speak. But he inflicted that on very educated people in Europe. So I think there are these particular ways of ordering narratives about the world. So I think the narrative of a Holocaust in which the West is a liberator of the death camps. I mean, of course, we know that the West actually didn't liberate the death camps; it was the Soviet Union. But I think most people today, if you talk to them in the United States or Western Europe, you ask them about their understanding of events. I think very few people will actually tell you that it was the Red Army that liberated those death camps. Anyway, the West makes those claims. Claims to have fought the Second World War against totalitarianism, and then learned enough from the lessons of the Holocaust to invest their faith and their sort of support, endless support, moral and material, for the state of Israel. Now, with imperialism, I think a much longer history of imperialism, a much longer history of violence, a much longer history of slavery. That is a narrative in which most Western powers come off very badly. And there's no incentive to embrace these narratives or to use them in any kind of way whatsoever. And there's certainly no diplomatic or geopolitical benefit to be drawn from these narratives. So, one reason, they have never been dominant. And today, if you speak of decolonization, you might be denounced as, an instance of woke virus. That's how Elon Musk describes decolonization. Respectable magazines speak of decolonization in this way, because these are areas where people don't want to go to, and have never really wanted to go to. So I think my attempt was to actually examine these ways of positioning yourself in the world at large, and of course, people in the West have done it through telling themselves stories of the Second World War and the Holocaust. But there are other stories that a vast majority of the world's population tells itself about the past and the present and the future. And in those stories, the two world wars and the Holocaust don't really feature much. What features in them is their liberation from European and American white masters. And with Israel and Gaza, those narratives have started to collide, with South Africa going to the ICJ in The Hague, accusing Israel of genocide, being supported by various countries from the non-Western world, countries with their own memories of racial imperialism. And of course, we see on one side, the sort of white Western powers, and I include Australia and New Zealand in this category, Canada, coming together to stand with Israel. How do we move on from there? I mean, I think that's something else that I take up in this book towards the end, because I think neither the narrative of imperialism, which is, what people like Donald Trump are trying to revive now to enthuse their followers. We can take Greenland, we can take, maybe turn Canada into 51st state, take over Gaza, a certain kind of fantasy of imperialism that he's using to, attract and enchant many of his supporters who are otherwise going to get very disillusioned with him very soon. At the same time, you have people in Asia and Africa invoking their own narratives of victimhood and often using them in the same way Israel has used the memory of the Holocaust to secure power and legitimacy for themselves. These are plainly self-serving narratives. Once you acknowledge them as narratives being deployed by people to serve particular interests, particular ends, you can acknowledge the historical veracity, but at the same time see that they are actually being exploited, they're actually being manipulated in the service of powerful interests. So, what do we do as ordinary citizens or ordinary listeners and readers or people who want a better world for ourselves? We can't imprison ourselves within these narratives. We have to think about a world in which we don't look so much at the history of imperialism or the history of anti-colonialism. We look at the future and we look at the challenges facing us, whether it's the transition to green technologies, whether it's a challenge posed by artificial intelligence, whether it's a challenge posed by the far right. I think remaining trapped within these historical narratives that started in the 19th century is a guarantee that we would be extremely ill-equipped to face some of the challenges looming in the future.
Beautifully put. I would like to just sidetrack a little bit because there's one bit of the book that you cover, your own interesting experience with the ideas of Zionism, particularly in regards to your background. And this is something that is unfamiliar to many outside of India. And that is this is not your particular case, of course, but it is a case that is common in India, and is that is the obsession with Zionism by certain Hindu nationalists. Why is this the case, particularly for India? Why is this a cause that has resonated with certain aspects of this form of nationalism? And how does it work in practice within India? If you could comment, please.
Well, I'd say in the crudest way, the Israeli suppression of Palestinians, which many people in India really see as a suppression of Muslims. Most people who support Israel in India are probably not even aware that a large part of the Palestinian population is Christian. They see Israel as a majoritarian Jewish supremacist state, putting down Muslims brutally, and they absolutely love it because that's something they would love to do in India itself as part of a Hindu supremacist formation, and often do it, but not, with the same kind of systematic brutality that Israel deploys. So there is that kind of envious admiration of Israel for doing what they themselves would love to do back home. And again, as I said earlier, we have to look at Israel as enabling, supporting, encouraging, stoking a wider culture of violence and impunity around the world. So it's not just the far right that's seeking inspiration from it, it's also the far right in places like India. And I'm sure we'll become aware very soon in other places as well. I mean, we've already seen that in Argentina. We've also seen, complete maniacs like Bolsonaro of Brazil affiliating himself to this far right regime in Israel. Now, I hope I can say that my own kind of attraction to Zionism or the state of Israel or specific figures like Moshe Dayan was not motivated by this kind of crude desire to humiliate Muslims. It was something broader. I think for many people in my family and in larger networks in the 70s, Israel was a successful nation state. It had developed a very strong sense of nationality. It had managed to bind its diverse citizens into a very cohesive national community. And, there was a sort of, also a kind of admiration for how firmly Israel had treated its sort of, minorities or people who did not really belong to the Jewish mainstream. But that was not so dominant back then. I think back then it was mostly a kind of admiration for highly organized society, almost along militaristic lines. And in fact, one of the people I admired and looked up to was Moshe Dayan, the Israeli general. I think what's interesting, and again, worth remembering, because this is, these are some of the ironies of global history, that while admiring Zionism at the same time for its clear self-definition, for its clear-cut identity, we also admired the ideology that in many people's eyes would seem completely opposed to Zionism, which is Nazism. There is a persistent and now, increasingly influential cult of Adolf Hitler in India. You can read lots of articles on the internet about this. Hitler is admired across India as a great nationalist. Very few people know what he actually did, or especially what he inflicted on European Jews. He's seen as a man who created Germany into a very strong nation state. This is the lesson people take away from him and his book in particular, Mein Kampf, and sort of really kind of see that book as their Bible. The very same people who admire Nazism or think of Hitler as the hero are also people today who admire Zionism. So I think these kinds of historical reversals, these kinds of grotesque ironies, tell us about the way in which our ideas, our definitions of nationalist movements, of histories are constantly changing, that they are never fixed. We should never try to fix them. We should never say this is this one thing and has remained, eternal along. That the quest for a nation state or a sovereign country that Hindus or Jews jointly embarked upon in the 19th century, that is what is still going on. That quest has been corrupted many times over. And now it increasingly resembles those very same political pathologies of imperialism, of racism, that those nationalisms were originally a response to.
Very, very clearly delineated. I'm wondering, just to dig a little bit deeper, again, this is mostly for my own interest, but also I'm sure the audience's interest, because again, for the vast majority of the world, we're so far removed from the Indian perspective, particularly on the nuances politically. How is this presenting itself in the modern day in India? Is there a call towards a Zionist form to be established within India that parallels this? Is there something politically driven which wants to bring the two nations closer, at least ideologically, if not even institutionally?
Well, I think the government is the main driver of this. The Hindu nationalist government. Public opinion is still, very divided on this issue. India was traditionally a supporter of Palestinian rights, both at the level of governments and also, in popular culture, there was a lot of support for Palestinians. There remains a great degree of support for Palestinians across the country in the general population. I mean, you have to remember the large numbers of Indians who are not aware of the situation at all. But those who are, many of them feel extremely sympathetic to Palestinians, and many people who had really no opinion on the matter, fairly well read, fairly well informed, have simply been shocked into understanding the situation more closely, shocked by Israel's atrocities. I think especially the murder of children. I mean, when I go back to India, I was just there recently, all kinds of people that I've engaged in conversation with always ask me this one question, and I'm very intrigued by this. Like, why is this question so dominant in India? It's like, how come they can kill so many children without anyone protesting about this? And so I think even for many middle class people who really didn't, have strong opinions on this issue, now do have very strong opinions. So it's really the government that has been, in a way, institutionalizing its sympathy for Israel, its admiration for Israel, in various arms deals, in various security arrangements, in buying spying software from Israel, which it then used against various dissenters, against journalists, including people I personally know. And so I think, in recent weeks, actually, it has started to moderate its position somewhat because it realizes that actually there are these other states in the region that are now decisively turning against Israel, including countries like Saudi Arabia, and it's probably not such a good idea to keep supporting Israel so vehemently. And so you need to nuance your position a little bit more, and that's what they've been doing.
Very, very interesting. Good to know. Thank you for that overview, and for the clarity. For, as mentioned, a lot of people aren't too involved with this. I would like to bring us slowly into the conclusion of today's talk, which is within the scope of the book, but kind of zooming out a little bit. And I know soothsayer, you can't look into the future, but you've been following the news like all the rest of us, and you've written a very erudite and penetrating book about the analysis of what's been happening, particularly over the past couple of weeks, but especially over the past couple of months, and over a year now since October 7th. Now Donald Trump is in office. Things seem less predictable, but as precarious as they've ever been, particularly when the United States is the hegemon as it has been. But how does, in your opinion, how does the future of Palestine look like to you over the next little while, fundamentally, and also more broadly, the general like march of history onwards? What is your look or analysis after the research that you've done in this book and the analysis that you've delivered there?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard not to have a sense of foreboding when you look at what Trump has been up to in recent weeks, and what might actually happen between the time we record this conversation and the moment when you actually broadcast it. A lot of things could happen, because we are in that sort of phase of history where things are accelerating, and the things that used to happen over a period of 10 years are happening in a single week. We may be in a state of war in the Middle East in the next week or so. United States may have joined Israel in bombing Gaza, carrying out the threat that Donald Trump made yesterday. They could, Israelis and the Americans could be bombing Iran the following week. I think it's become extremely hard to speak of a future in which stability, even a minimum stability that allows you to predict things, is guaranteed. So I think I certainly would not make any kind of predictions, because I think all our conversations, whether it's about the future of the Palestinians or the future of the world at large, really are kind of derived from certain as innocent assumptions about the world became remaining relatively at peace, and then there are conflicts to resolve, there are problems to address. But now I think we've kind of entered a phase where a lot of very dramatic and dark things can happen, and probably will happen. So I think we should prepare for those things with fortitude, with some sort of vision, instead of kind of really musing in the way we were accustomed to about the future of Palestine or Palestinians, because I think we're already looking at, within the next week or so, at some very drastic move in the region. And so it's hard to now even speak of the prospects of a Palestinian state. It's like we are looking at endless war. I mean, in fact, endless war is what we have been living with for some months now. It stopped briefly for a few weeks, and now it looks like it's going to be resumed.
Yeah. No, like you said, it's a an approach that we have to have with a certain level of foreboding, of fortitude, of education, and of course of the necessary organization and the plan going forward, particularly across the very diverse cultural landscapes that we all come from, and in regards to what the future might hold. This has been a lovely discussion today. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but we really appreciate that you came on and gave us or allowed us to pick at your mind a little bit. the book in question, The World After Gaza, that we're discussing primarily in this discussion, is being published as we speak, I believe.
Yes.
So, and we got one of the few perks of doing this job is getting pre-publishing copies to read, which was an absolute pleasure of ours. But we highly recommend you guys go out and pick up the book yourselves. Do you have any final statements?
No, this was this is very bracing. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'd love to have you on again, especially if you continue publishing such magnificent work.
Thank you, Hakeem.